Education Committee, and I kind of always thought of the idea of being a corporate parent as much wider than just the local authority. Any public body in the area which had any responsibility for children, from my perspective.
Well, at the moment, the duties apply to local authorities rather than other bodies, but the proposal is to widen that out. And at Become, we provide the Secretariat for the APPG on children in care, and they've just done an inquiry which we supported, looking at how young people would like corporate parenting to be expanded and the kind of range of ways in which other bodies could do that. And we did that in advance, expecting a government consultation on corporate parenting, and we're still not sure when that's coming, and it would then require legislation following that.
I mean, I'm thinking particularly since, you know, I've been in this place since 2010, but since 2010 there's been a massive rise, for instance, in the growth of multi-academy trust schools. The multi-academy trust schools take on many of the responsibilities that local authorities used to have to go towards children and their education. Would we not regard them within the corporate parenting envelope?
I think it would be great to see that. It would be great to see legislation extend to exactly those kind of bodies, because we know, for example, that children in care are more likely to be excluded from the school system. So it's exactly in those areas where it could make a real difference. So that's one area that we'd absolutely like to see taken.
Getting on and consulting so that they can come forward with the legislation would be welcome. Thank you for that. Lynn, can I bring you in on that first question, just around the aims of the strategy and how deliverable it is?
Yeah, thank you. It's certainly a step in the right direction, and we welcome some of the proposals and some of the specific progress that's been made already in terms of things like the Family First Pathfinder programme being launched, work to reform the guidance on advocacy and the revised guidance on multi-agency working. Also, some smaller step change on funding, offering some quite welcome initiatives, things like setting up home grant for care leavers being increased, and an increased level of financing for the extended rollout of staying close, and importantly, I think the launch of the kinship care strategy. So there are certainly some areas where there is progress, but we think the pace of the progress is too slow, and as Catherine has already outlined, there is a lack of investment to make this happen and to realise the ambitions, and also the legislative changes that Catherine was talking about we haven't seen. We also need some stability. We've had 5 changes in the Children's Minister in the last 2 years, and of course we are facing into a general election year. So what we would like to see is reform. There's a real concern, I think, that momentum might be lost despite some of the progress that's been made, and the gap in funding from the 2.6 billion and the 200 million is obviously very significant. Some of the areas that we'd like to see legislated for include placing new family help teams on a statutory level, new rights for care leavers, including a statutory entitlement to staying put, and changing homeless legislation to make sure that care leavers are given a priority. There's also an opportunity for a new opt-out right to an advocate for all children in care that could be included in legislative reform.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's very helpful for this committee when we're holding ministers to account to be able to chase up on some of those legislative points. So I think that is, I'm grateful for those pointers. Will, thank you for waiting patiently.
It's okay. I'd like to kind of agree with what we've heard previously. I think that gets it right. We asked our membership what they thought of what they'd seen so far of the review. They don't think it goes far enough. They don't think there's enough focus on care leavers. They don't think there was enough focus on residential care. And the majority didn't think the kind of mission outlined would produce significant change, I'm afraid, because there is a feeling that things happen far too slowly, or they just don't happen. Many people point to the Conservative Party manifesto, which promised to review the care system to make sure that all care placements and settings are providing children and young adults with the support they need. And in the view of the CLA, this has got a very low priority in this review. There could have, in fact, we think, been a number of separate reviews, one on early intervention, which we think is really important, and there's a lot of work gone on in early intervention for a very long time. It's important to do. 2, child protection, 3, the care system, and 4, the workforce. And we just think that the original impetus for the lives of care leavers going through the system, leaving care, it's not reflected in the review.
Okay, so what, from where we are now, what changes would you be pushing for to take that further?
Much of what's been mentioned before, actually. I wouldn't want to repeat that, but I think one of the issues that I think is problematic is that there's lots of good stuff written down, but ensuring it's delivered on the ground is a big problem, and we have to think about that. Because you can have local offers. I mean, I don't want it, well, I'm going to say postcode lottery, because that's what it is. There needs, we kind of agree with what Bernarda's are putting forward in terms of saying there needs to be baselines in terms of bus fares and leaving care and all that kind of stuff. But also, we kind of welcome some more space there to have innovation as well. Actually, from local work, you can get innovations that you really haven't thought of. Yeah, so a firm baseline of what's provided, but some innovation as well. Because otherwise, understandably, authorities and practitioners step back to what's
the statutory?
What's the statutory?
Yeah.
And actually that can be a mistake because you don't learn.
Yeah. And clearly across all 3 of you, there's a concern about resourcing here fundamentally, and that the organisations which are charged with these responsibilities need the resources in order to carry them out effectively. I'll go over to Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you so much. We understand that children's social services are struggling. There's a huge demand for children to get into children's services care. But can you please tell us what are the reasons why this demand is increasing every day, and what the local authorities can do to tackle this, and how much pressure they are under when it comes to the funding? What's the difference?
I think if you look over a long time period, we've seen a kind of consistent rise for the last at least 10 years in the numbers of children in care. One of the drivers of that is poverty, and there's quite clear evidence that there are links between a rise in poverty in the population and a rise in children in care, because we know poverty puts pressure on families, is linked to rises in abuse and neglect, and is linked to children entering the care system. I think at the same time you've seen reductions in early support services, so whether that's youth services or early family help, again over the last kind of decade or so we've seen a reduction to many of those services, so more families are reaching a crisis point where children are coming into the care system, and at the same time they're not then getting the support that children might come out of the care system and go back to their family home, because that's less likely without the support there. So I think they are contributory factors. There's been a kind of change in the care population, so there are more older teenagers coming into the care system for a range of reasons, some of which are to do with risks outside the family home. So gang-related violence, sexual exploitation, county lines, things like that. So they are a factor as well. And I think particularly in recent years, we've seen a rise in unaccompanied asylum-seeking children entering the care system as well. So 10,000 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children now in the care system, and that's double what it was a few years ago. So there's been an increase, and they are a significant proportion, but if you look at overall numbers of 84,000, they're still a small number, but that is a factor, and particularly over the last couple of years, there's actually been a drop in unaccompanied asylum-seeking children coming into the care system, and the rise is due to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. That's only in the last couple of years, and I think it's COVID related. So what you've seen is during COVID, the numbers of children in need have gone down because children are not coming to were not coming to the attention of authorities, in the same way that they were previously. Children at risk were not being picked up on. So I think that is what we're seeing in the numbers.
Those numbers, you feel?
Exactly, and I think what you're likely to see as you look forward is the numbers of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children go up once that kind of COVID effect works its way through.
Lynn, you...
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree. I think the pressures at the moment on children's social care, are at an all-time high, more children in care now than ever before. 83,840 was the last figure. That's an increase of 23% over the last decade. And I think, as Catherine says, it comes at the same time as what we've seen is a reduction in available resources to meet that need. And what that means for local authorities is very, very difficult decisions for directors of children's services who are required to meet their statutory obligations, but are having to disinvest in early help and early intervention. And I think that funding position is becoming increasingly precarious in local authorities. So we've seen a number of Section 114 notices issued now, and the LGA recently reported nearly 1 in 5 councils are concerned about bankruptcy in the next 2 years. So what that means is that the system is very much focused on late intervention and very much at the high end, as opposed to intervening at an earlier time when actually change might be possible within families. We did some research with other leading children's charities, and funding for early intervention services has reduced significantly, 45% over the last 12 years reduction in early intervention services. But there is actually a fiscal and a human case for investment in early intervention. We did a cost-benefit analysis of some work that Bernardo's runs on the Isle of Wight. It's an intensive family support service, and we found that for every £1 invested in the service, the saving in costs to the state was £2.60. So there is a fiscal, there is an economic case for investment in early intervention, and I'm sure that many local authorities would like to invest there, but have to currently spend their money on meeting their statutory duties.
Early intervention is very important, Will, but what is your advice to government? What can they do to reverse this trend in demand?
One of the things that could be done, is to ring fence resource for early intervention and prevention. One of the recommendations that we've made through a children's charity coalition manifesto, which we have recently published, is to suggest that there is also a greater proportion of expenditure ring-fenced for children and young people. And that's one of the things that we would call for. I think that does provide protection. It would ensure that money was invested and would continue to be used for prevention. But there is also, of course, a requirement for some flexibility at a local level, because I think, as Will alluded to earlier, that there are differences in local authority areas that need to be taken into consideration.
I mean, that's easily said, Lynn, about ring fencing, because you've said in a few previous sentences there that money's being taken from early intervention to perform statutory duties. So therefore, if you ring fence the money for early intervention, that then will probably lead to a shortfall in money to perform statutory duties and crisis management. So what's the solution to that then? I mean, you're just moving the solution from one place to another from a financial perspective. Now, I mean, I would say, let's invest in our children's services to a much greater extent, because it's quite clear that from everything which is being said, there is a shortfall there. But if you ring fence one pot, you're going to have a shortfall in another pot.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the challenge is, if you don't invest in earlier intervention and prevention services, you never turn off that demand for late intervention and crisis services, which we know are very expensive. That's where local authorities are spending a lot of their money. I think there are other things that could be looked at across the system, and you asked a question earlier about corporate parenting duties. pleased to see an extension of corporate parenting across a range of different agencies. I think would provide additional resource to support children in care and children leaving care. But unless we do something differently, this is not something that we are going to be able to address.
Could I just add a point on that? I think as well, when we look at the system, there isn't no money in the system. You know, when we look at the provision of children's homes, for example, residential care, 85% of those are provided by private providers, some of whom, not all, but some of whom are making 20% profits. So I think that is not the only answer, but I think, you know, it's not as simple as there being no money. There is a question over how we spend that money. And I do think there are questions when we have the system in the kind of crisis that it is about what is acceptable in terms of levels of profit. And there are elements of profiteering. And I think there are questions over you know, how we address that in the round.
Yeah.
Okay, so in their 2023 risk register, DFE identified the children's social care market at risk of failure. Do you agree with this assessment? And do you think issues are regional or national?
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. I think the risk is very high. The Competition and Markets Authority did an inquiry particularly looking at the provision of the private provision of residential care, and it sounded similar alarm bells to what's on the DFE's register. So I think you do have a system that is at a crisis point, that is completely overwhelmed, and you have local authorities saying this is the single biggest area of overspend for them, children's social care. And, you know, we're seeing local authorities facing serious financial difficulties. So in answer to whether it's a national or a local problem, I think it's both. I think it is an issue that is affecting local authorities across the country. There are local elements to it as well. There are different kind of factors and drivers in different areas. So I think it's both a national problem and it needs national oversight, but there are local factors which come into play in different areas too.
Want to add anything? Okay, that's fine.
I mean, the market is working in the sense if you want to make lots of money. The market's not working if you're a council that's absolutely strapped for cash. And something's gone really badly wrong and it needs to be looked at really, really quickly. I would also say that later on, and as I said before, early intervention is important, but later on when young people are leaving the care system, they're also feeling the impact of leaving care with councils that are cash strapped, because there is a tendency to kind of go, okay, you're 21 or you're 18, you're off the books almost, and we don't have to really think about you. And that has an impact on young people leaving the care system, maybe trying to get bursaries, maybe trying to go into education, employment help. They kind of disappear far too early, and that's because they're strapped for cash. That's the only, you know, it's not that people don't care. It's that if you're looking at who do we help next, we help the 17-year-old, not the person who's 19 or 20. And so they're just disappearing now.
We're seeing more of that. Councils trying to cut back that support and bring the age forward of the support they provide to care leavers, definitely. And I think it's also just worth adding, because we've talked a lot about the impact on local authorities and finances, and that's extremely important. But, you know, the real people who are suffering here are the children and young people themselves, and we are seeing that in their experience of the care system with very high levels of instability, young people often being moved a great distance away from everything and everyone they know. So there's a real human impact for children in the system now.
Yeah.
And on that very point, I'll bring in Nick.
Just before I go on to the questions that I've got here, the children that are coming in, do we have the statistics on boys and girls? How many boys are coming in and how many girls do we actually have?
Yeah, I don't have them in front of me, but there are. Certainly.
Something that we could have. And it's saying, do you carry any data on children coming from separated families?
I don't think that that's recorded, but I can double check for you.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Moving on to the questions in front of me, we know from recent data that 17,630 children in care were placed more than 20 miles away from their home. You've recently launched a campaign calling for government to stop out of area placements. What steps can the government take to reduce this? It is a huge issue. I mean, I've got about 3 care homes in Doncaster that have closed down, and we've got an ongoing case with that. And I genuinely do believe that if parents can see the children easily, then they could obviously probably see if there's something, if something's not quite right. Yeah. I think parents are probably best placed to do that. But if they're more than 20 miles away, that can be a real stretch for some families to get to them. So.
Absolutely. I think so. We have seen an increase in the numbers of children being placed at great distance from their local area, and what that means for children is having to leave their school or possibly commute a couple of hours a day back. So huge disruption to their education, separated from their friends, separated from their community, often moved to a different area of the country they just don't know at all. And we know how much variety there is across the country. It can be very different moving from somewhere in the south to somewhere in the northwest, for example. And really tragically, we see brothers and sisters being separated as well. And those relationships are vital for all of us. But I think particularly if you're in care, those relationships with your siblings can be so crucial. But sadly, because of the pressure on the care system and the distances that children are being moved, with 1 in 5 of all children in care being moved more than 20 miles away, we're seeing more and more of that kind of separation and disruption. And also, it's worth adding, it's not that you are moved once 20 miles away and then you have an opportunity to kind of settle there. You might be moved frequently. We know a high proportion of children are moved multiple times, often to different parts of the country. So these are children who've been through a lot of trauma in coming into the care system, and then they don't have that stability, that opportunity to rebuild their lives and heal from some of that trauma, because the care system replicates some of it by moving them around, causing a huge amount of instability. And I think if you think about your own children, if you've ever moved house and moved their school, the kind of thought and consideration you put into that and how they're going to settle in a new area. For children in care, it might be, we're moving you next week to this area you've never heard of. So it's a real problem, and it's getting worse.
Why are two questions. Why are they moved? And ask that one, answer that one first, and then I'll follow up with another one.
They're moved because there are not enough places for them to live. So local authorities are scrabbling around to find wherever they can, and often that might not be in the local area. And they're also moved because of a lack of sufficiency, means that the places that they're placed in the first place are often not a good match, or might be a temporary or short-term placement because that's all that's available, might not meet their needs, and so either the plan was it was only ever temporary, or the placement breaks down because there hasn't been a good match, and so that's the kind of frequent moves.
So would you think it's, even though it's very disruptive for a child to be moved from one place to another, if they're moving closer to home, would you say that that's always, that it's still a good move, even though it might be disruptive? So
there are some children for whom it is the right thing to move them away from their local area, for example if they're safeguarding issues. But what if there's a gang or something, a reason they're unsafe in their local area, there are absolutely valid reasons to move children away. However, what we're seeing with the rise is that, and our suspicion is that the majority of the moves are not because of the child's best interest, they're because of a lack of availability. And one of the things that we've called for is to distinguish between those two, so we can understand those children who are being moved when it's genuinely in their best interest, and those who are being moved because there's nothing else for them. And we'd like to see that recorded, and that's one of the things that we've called for.
Can I just bring Anna in quickly, and then Mohammed? I think we've got lots of people wanting to comment on this. So.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, you've mentioned that this is a real problem and getting worse, children being placed 20 miles or so away, and you mentioned the disruption to their education in terms of travel, but there's also the disruption in terms of having to settle into a new school. So are you tracking the educational attainment for that cohort that are being moved, so that there might be an evidence base to show how bad for them educationally that is?
I think that's a really good question. I don't know if that data is recorded. What we do know is that the well-being scores of those children who move further away are worse than for other children. It would be interesting to look into, and I can certainly take it away, whether you would imagine that will also impact on education. And we know as well there's no kind of regard for where a child might be in their educational journey, so it could be like bang smack in the middle of your exams that you're moved. And we hear of that happening frequently, or just coming up. So of course it's going to have a real impact, I think, on their ability to do that.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So how difficult it is for you to tell us that how many out-of-area placements are appropriate due to specialized care needs, and how many are inappropriate? Because there's hardly any data available.
Yeah, well, we don't know because it's not recorded in that way, and that's one of the things we think needs to happen, because there will be children for whom out of area placements. And actually, we say it's less focusing on out of area, because if you take somewhere like London, for example, you could be in a different borough, but actually not that far from your local area. We think the distance away that you're placed is more important, actually. But we don't have those figures, and we think that would be a really important thing to understand, actually.
I think it's, you've got people in care who are living quite fragmented lives because of what's happened to them. And I think you're right, they meet a very fragmented system. And that is a recipe for failure, really. And one of the messages we get is about continuity and consistency is really, really, really important. And that's what the system should be trying to provide. But it almost feels that almost everything is set against that. It's actually, people have given so many hurdles to get over that the idea of consistency and continuity is never going to be attained. And if we're going to look at anything, we really need to get a grip with that. Because, particularly with education, it's disastrous. I think it's disastrous because people, people find it very hard to focus. People change schools. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday. She said, when I went to care, I changed schools, and because I was care leave, I was put in lower sets. Yeah, because there's trouble and all this kind of stuff, and that's not unusual.
But is there not a simple economic imperative as to why so many of the places which are available for young people out of borough are where they are?
Yeah.
Right. Well, put it on the record, for goodness sake.
Absolutely. I think one of the factors so there is a general issue with sufficiency. There is also an issue with where, particularly with children's homes, so less so with foster care, but particularly with children's homes, they are concentrated in areas where property is cheaper, and they don't match the need in those local areas.
And what also happens, though, is that you get in areas where property is cheaper, quite often the local services aren't particularly brilliant either, are they?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the things, actually, that young people who have left care have also told us that they experience in terms of being able to access accommodation through private arrangements. They are often, as a result of being care leavers, disadvantaged in that. But I do think, there are some fundamental reforms of commissioning arrangements that need to take place to address some of the issues that we have just been talking about here. So we really support the work of Become on this area. What we're concerned about are the increased risks of exploitation for children and young people who are moved away from support networks, who have discontinuity both of care, but also some of the wider protective systems that children interface with, like schools, and so disruption in education exposes them to further risk. And we know statistically that children and young people in care and leaving care are overrepresented in the not in education, employment or training stats. So these are long-term significant impacts. But the high dependency on the private sector to provide homes, I think 78% of homes are now provided by the private sector, does mean that factors like the price of housing are driving decisions about where homes are established, rather than those decisions being made on the basis of the needs of children and young people within the population.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just
Sorry.
We need
say something about, because you mentioned residential care. I mean, we think it's really important that people see the value of residential care. It's really, really important. A couple of years ago, somebody put a question out on one of the private Facebook pages that I run, saying, what was your time in a children's home like? And there was about 100 responses, and I went through and counted them all. And something like 30% said they really enjoyed it. It was the best thing that had ever happened to them, and they felt safe there. And it's really worth bearing in mind that it will always have a place in the system. It will. And for some people, it's a really good option, because you don't want to go back into a small house when you've just come from a small house when some bad things might have happened. You know, that can feel threatening in itself. Larger establishments can give you space, you know, that you might need as an individual when you've gone through a very traumatic experience, and that's quite an important thing as well. So there needs to be a supply of really good residential accommodation that is actually seen as very high quality and is seen as necessary. Because our feeling is that over the last 30 to 40 years, it's been there's been a move to kind of downplay it, thinking that family care is always best. And for about a third of care leavers, that's not true. And that's why you get a lot of people, you know, moving around the system, because they can't cope with small children's homes, they can't cope with foster care. So we need to do some serious thinking about that.
Thank you. Nick, do you want to...
Yeah, I mean, a freedom of information request was put into Doncaster Council about the annual placement of individual child in the financial year 2022-23, a child that was actually attending mainstream school, and the highest annual placement cost was £677,857. Yeah. We've heard of the £1 million child as well. I mean, these are extraordinary amounts of money. So do you believe that it's not a lack of money going into the system, it's how that money is actually being utilised? Because £677,000 for a local council to spend on one placement of a child who's in mainstream school is, well, it is mind-blowing to most people.
I think it's a bit of both. There are some children who have very complex needs, who need round-the-clock care, who may need workers for them, and it can be expensive to accommodate them. However, when those places are being provided by companies who make 20% profit on them, then I think there are questions to ask about how we are spending that money, and whether it could be better spent and reinvested in the system. So there are questions around profiteering. It is also an underfunded system, and I think both things can be. I mean, 20% is just a usual business. The businesses want to make 20%, and profit shouldn't be a swear word, and obviously they'll be paying tax on those profits and so on and so forth, so forth, so forth. But £677,000 for a child that's attending mainstream school, there's something broken there, isn't there, for that to happen? And it's crippling councils up and down the country. This is not a Doncaster issue. This is up and down the country. So we really need to look at what we can do with this. Plus the fact that obviously these children are, I mean, it shouldn't be about the money, or it should always be about what's best for that child. I'm sure £677,000 has not been spent very wisely there. I'm sure it hasn't. It can't be. I mean, you can go to Eton for whatever that costs, can't you? I mean, it's just huge sums of money here. Yeah, they're huge sums of money when we're talking about an individual child, and I don't think we've properly looked into the whole system. And actually, I think one of the big areas missing in the government's plans was really looking into that issue of sufficiency. They talk about commissioning, and commissioning is part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. I think there's an issue around supply and provision more generally that hasn't really been looked into and should be.
Do you want one more, and then I'll go to Flick?
Okay, thank you. You have described the consequences of out-of-area placement for children and young people in the care. You have recently launched a campaign asking the government to stop out-of-area placements. What do you think, what steps government can take to reduce the number of out-of-area placements?
We think there needs to be a national commitment to placing children far from home. We think there needs to be a national strategy, because it is a national issue, particularly when you're getting children placed at different parts of the country. It needs to be looked at in the round, but there also needs to be local plans too. A significant number of councils don't produce sufficiency plans, even though they are required to. So we think that needs addressing. We think there needs to be better monitoring and accountability as well. So I mentioned recording that difference between placements which are in a child's best interest and those placements made because there's no other places available, and we think that needs to happen. So a number of measures which look to improve this situation.
You need a pretty good coding system to get that right, wouldn't you? Because what you wouldn't want is a situation where every time a council just said, oh, it's in the child's best interest because we have to do it. I mean, that's...
Definitely. It would need some thought about how you make that work, but I don't believe, that's beyond the wit of how to...
Brilliant, Flick.
So going back to unaccompanied asylum seeker children, so you mentioned that there were 7,000, which must have a massive impact on the rising demand, but also out of area placements. What impact is it actually having?
Yeah, happy to. Do you want to?
Just on that out of area placements particularly, it's worth noting that unaccompanied asylum seeking children are much more likely to be placed in supported accommodation than in children's homes. If you're asking, does it map, there's more unaccompanied asylum seeking children, so more children are being placed out of area. That's definitely not the case, because actually it's more likely that their location is less likely to be recorded. Unaccompanied asylum seeking children, the distance place is less, so it's not contributing to the rise in the numbers of children who it's being recorded are being placed further away.
That's helpful.
Yeah, no, not at all. So I think it's important to just recognise that unaccompanied asylum seeking children account for fewer than 1 in 10 children in care, but the number is growing. So the increase went from 5,100 back in 2019 to 7,200 in 2023. So of course, the need for provision that effectively meets their needs has also increased significantly. And I think it's important to recognise the level of trauma that many unaccompanied asylum-seeking children experience, and the need to meet that with specialist provision is also very important. I mean, after the recent judgment, of course, hotel accommodation has now been closed, but as Catherine said, many young people are in supported accommodation provision. The Children's Commissioner, her recent report examining homelessness found that of the 6,000 children aged 16 and 17 who were presenting as homeless in 2022 to 23, 18% were unaccompanied children seeking asylum. So we know that there is a lot of unmet need, and unaccompanied children must be taken into care when they arrive in the UK so that they can start to get the help that they need, having faced the issues that they have. We ran back in 2010 a safe accommodation project which provided specialist placements for children and young people who are at risk or victims of sexual exploitation and trafficking. And that programme involved providing foster carers with a range of training to enable them to better meet the specific needs of those children. We employed specialist workers, and the outcomes from that programme were really positive. It was very effective in meeting needs. So we think that should be part of a strategic plan for welcoming all refugee children and children seeking asylum, and give them the best possible start to life. But that would require investment, of course, in specialist foster care placements, or, if appropriate, access to supported accommodation with the right wraparound level of support. So the National Foster Recruitment Campaign should contain a specific target for recruiting foster carers for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children to meet that need. And we could have some bespoke and targeted approaches within that wider campaign. And also work with the sector, who have been doing a lot of work in this area to develop training and the right level of support to provide that specialist care that's required.
Out of those 7,000, how many are actually receiving specialist care and help, or are there ones falling through the gaps?
Don't have that data available to me now, but I think the findings from the Children's Commissioner report that I noted earlier give some cause for concern about the level of homelessness.
Yeah. Is there any further steps you think that the government should be doing to provide appropriate care and protection under the 1989 Children's Act? Or is everything in place? Because we talked about legislation before. Is there any further legislation that's needed? Was it all there ready? Fine.
I think a lot of it comes down, probably in this area, less to legislation and more to sufficiency and availability of specialist placements.
Yeah.
Like Lynn said, that there aren't enough, and a high proportion of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children are placed into a supported accommodation rather than into care, so they won't receive care in those settings, they'll only receive support. That is a wider issue, which maybe we'll come onto, but there has been a big increase in the number of 16 and 17-year-olds being placed in supported accommodation, which might be a hostel or a B&B or even a barge or caravan, and not receiving the same level of care that younger children are receiving. And that's got worse since the introduction of a new regulatory regime around that.
There's still quite a lot of these unaccompanied asylum children who are in children's.
Yes, exactly. There's
What percentage?
I can get you the exact percentage, but it's a higher proportion of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children than other children that.
Yeah, because presumably quite a few of them in the hotels which are slowly closing, and then they've found places for them, or they may end up on the streets, I suppose.
Yeah, so they will be placed in hostels, in B&Bs, or in other forms of.
Yeah, which is inappropriate for children. Yeah.
Can I just say something about the specialist services, which is that it's actually reflective of a wider problem in the system, which is that a lot of young people in care have experienced trauma. And having looked at the review and having looked at the response to it, we just don't see a sufficient response in terms of specialist care for children who have post-traumatic stress. And it's a case that sometimes if you're 16 and you're trying to get into CAMS, people say, forget it, because it won't appear until you're an adult. I mean, it's that bad. And so it must be worse for asylum-seeking children as well. And the thing to remember about this is that you are storing up trouble. I mean, we get for those individuals, you know, you get people who are 40 ringing us up, talking to us about the need to access their files and having lived with something for 25 years and it only now coming to the front of their minds at a time of crisis. So certainly for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, definitely, but wider across the system, there is just an absence of specialist care. And it's a big issue, I think.
Just on that though, how much of that specialist care should be being commissioned through the care system versus getting CAMS working really effectively and scaling up what's on offer there, making sure it's being delivered through the health system?
It should be a mix, but what you'd want to see is that if a child is having particular problems, they can get a resource through the childcare system or the local authority, wherever it comes from. People are alerted to it and the resource is there.
And I mean, just thinking about some of the points that were being made earlier about corporate parenting and extending that to other bodies, presumably if that were being extended to local health organisations, that would help in that regard.
Yes, I think it would. I think it's a good idea. There's just one caveat while we're on corporate parenting. A lot of care leavers don't like the phrase.
Yeah.
It feels completely cold. We're not suggesting that we've got a better idea, but we need to come up with one.
Okay, thank you, Ian.
Right, we're talking earlier on about early intervention, and you know, I saw the interesting figures from the pilot in Isle of Wight about the £1 spent on early intervention saving £2.60 down the line. I mean, so we've kind of skirted into that territory, but is there anything in particular you can think of that we can do to improve early intervention apart from the money?
Well, I think we've talked about some of the pressures that need to be balanced here, and I recognise that is a challenge. But I think, you know, we do need an effective reform programme that looks at helping families sooner and getting the right support to those who can't live with their birth parents. There has been a significant increase in children in care who are living in semi-independent accommodation in recent years, and that's as a result of increasing numbers of older children coming into care for whom it is often more difficult to find suitable placement. So the contention is that by concentrating on earlier intervention, a reform programme could help more children to stay safely with their families through that sort of intensive support, and would also, correspondingly reduce pressures in the system. So councils can provide a better level of care then for those children who do need it. So I talked earlier about a national foster carer recruitment campaign. I think that would help. I think it would also really help to do that with the voluntary sector, to recruit a range of carers to meet the needs of all children. We've talked about the diversity of the population of children who need care today. The scheme at the moment only focuses on local authority recruitment, and of course there are a number of independent fostering and adoption agencies within the sector. An expansion of the current independent visitor programme would also be helpful, so that every child who wants to have access to an independent visitor, a buddy or a mentor to support them during their time in care, can have one. And they would have, if we were to introduce an opt-out offer of advocacy, they would have that by default. And should they determine that they don't want it, then they can opt out of it. But it's really important, I think, in any reform programme, that the views, wishes, experiences and interests of children and young people are given full account of. I quoted earlier some of the statistics around the shift in spend, so a reduction of just over 3.7 billion since 2010-11, a fall of almost half in the investment in early intervention, and reversing that trend I think is absolutely critical if we want a system that effectively meets the needs of children. We do a practitioner survey quite frequently within Barnardo's, and workers in some of our family help services are also telling us that the lack of funding and priority for early help family support services means that the thresholds are getting higher, and it's getting harder and harder to meet the levels of demand in our services. Cases that are coming through the front door are no longer the cases that we would necessarily class as early help. So it's that presenting complexity as a result of not having sufficient investment that we're starting to see unfold. I will just finish by talking about a report that we did in collaboration with other children's charities that was called the Cost of Delay Report. That found, the research in that report found that delays to reform children's social care will cost public finances an extra $1 billion over the next 10 years. So a failure to invest in the long term will lead to a very significant budgetary problem. We've long called for a family hub in every community.
We as a committee.
Yes.
We're
of one accord in that.
Yeah. And that, I mean, we've looked at obviously from the perspective of the early years particularly, but actually particularly valid here in terms of the help and support that can be delivered.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, on the ground, I mean, certainly, the feedback I get from talking to teachers in schools, for instance, as a good example is that when they sort of have a concern about a child, the thresholds for intervention by children's social services seem to have gone up and up and up.
Yeah.
And therefore, we've moved right away from the early intervention in many localities in terms of ending up in crisis management situation quite often. And, that in itself has probably been one of the biggest drivers to the fact that the number of youngsters in the care of local authorities have gone up and up and up.
Yeah, and I think Catherine started by talking about the impact of poverty. I think the cost of living crisis is a real issue for the children and families that we work with within Barnardo's. schools. We run the attendance pilots in a number of schools, and we know that poverty and the impact of poverty is one of the challenges for children and young people getting into school, having the correct uniform, having money to be able to travel to school, having money for lunches, and actually for lots of children who are in care, that is also highly problematic.
Now, Will, in your written evidence, you stated that much of the focus of the government strategy, Stable Homes Built on Love, was on early intervention at the expense of children in the care system and care leavers. So how can the government provide an effective balance between focusing on current children in care and preventing children from going into care in the future?
Good question. I mean, it all down to resource. And it's all down to providing the right services, really, to get that balance right. I mean, to be honest, our focus is also on when you get after 25 and the effects of life after you've left the care system. And this is why actually getting it right really early on is important, because you don't want to end up with people who have significant social problems or very poor outcomes. So I would ask you I want to stretch your mind in terms of what is a care leaver, yeah, because it can be for many people a lifelong experience, and that really needs to be borne in mind. And there's some data that was produced by the Nuffield Foundation. I don't think they've put it into their submission, but in 2021, looking at mortality, where they're saying falling rates of premature mortality in the general population are not mirrored in the care leaver population. Adults who spent time in care as children between 1971 and 2001 were 70% more likely to die prematurely than those who did not. The extra risk of premature death rose for care leavers from 40% in 1971 to 360% in 2011. Right? And that tells you that something's going really wrong. So it is about early intervention, it is about continuity of care, and it is about not shutting the door when somebody's 25.
Yeah.
It's really important because this affects the health system, it affects the prison system, it affects the mental health system. And, you know, we've got to think about it in a much more long-range way. One final thing I would say on that, if we're going to go the whole way, which is that we're starting to do some work with colleagues in Australia about what happens to care leavers if they need to go into elderly care, and the impact it has on them. And it's important. So trying to stretch your mind a bit there about what a care leaver is and what the life experience is.
I mean, certainly, you know, and certainly the previous report that we did about leaving care, you know, we were struck then, and, you know, it was something we kind of knew, but it reinforced our attitude, was that, you know, youngsters who've been through the care system become traumatised adults. And, you know, vulnerable and traumatised adults, they need continuing care, you know, because, I mean, you know, as adults ourselves and having kids, you know, you never stop caring for or loving your kids. But, you know, those youngsters, the most vulnerable youngsters, quite often traumatised youngsters, become adults with the same problems. And, you know, they need that additional support.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Oh, sorry, Will.
There you go.
Very sadly, 1 in 3 young people leaving care become homeless within 2 years of leaving the care system.
There's a significant correlation between prison population and people who've come out of the care system as well.
Absolutely, and part of the reason for that is the care cliff that young people face when they come to leave care, the very abrupt transition into adulthood that's kind of forced upon them, often well before they're ready. So overnight, and for many young people on their 18th birthday, they have to leave the care system, and that often means moving out of the accommodation that they're in, many becoming homeless. So there really needs to be something done about that care cliff and ending that care cliff that sees too many young people struggling into adulthood.
And with that in mind, do you think, do all your organisations agree with the idea of making care experience a protected characteristic? Do you have any views on that? Are there any potential downsides of doing that?
I think there are growing calls from the care experience community for it to be made a protected characteristic. There are a mix of views, so there's not unanimity, and I think more needs to be done to understand the views of the care experience community. A lot of local authorities have voluntarily adopted the idea of care experience as a protected characteristic, so it'll be important to understand what's happening in those local areas and what more legislation could potentially bring and the kind of outcomes that it could achieve. So we think there needs to be more work.
Needs to be explored as a Lynn Johnson.
Yeah, I do think it's really important to recognise the stigma and discrimination, that is quite real for many children in care and who are leaving care. And I gave an example earlier of how difficult it is for young people who are leaving care to sometimes get accommodation through private rental arrangements. And of course, there are solutions to those things which we could do now without any requirement to change legislation in respect of a protected characteristic. So, for example, things like a guarantor scheme and a deposit scheme runs very successfully in Kent, very low default rate, would mean that young people would have access to better quality accommodation in better areas. That doesn't necessarily require us to place an equalities duty. And of course, there would inevitably be some delay in doing so. We talked earlier about the opportunity to potentially extend the corporate parenting principles, which is also something that could be done without young people having to have a protected characteristic as being care experienced. So it's interesting, and I think the exploration of it is right. There are, there's a diversity of opinion about it, but I think what's important is that we don't lose sight of what we can do, irrespective of whether or not we do introduce that as a protected characteristic. So. My concern would be just about not delaying things that we could put in place right now would really alleviate some of the pressures for young people.
Yeah. And Will, amongst your members, is that diversity of views?
Yes, but broadly in favour.
Right.
Don't think of it as a panacea. What you were making about services need to be good enough and need to be improved. And also there is questions raised about you can have a protected characteristic, but then that takes time to get through the system and lots of legal battles. So broadly, yes, but don't think of it as a solution.
And one of the things I was pleased to see in the care strategy was around the increases in bursaries for care leavers apprenticeships and some of those things. What else do you think needs to be done to improve participation in further higher and vocational education for care leavers?
So I think a big factor in children not doing well in education is the care cliff. So right in the middle of your exams, you might have to be leaving care and trying to find somewhere else to live. And that happens at 18, but actually, in truth, you start to think about it a long time before that, so you will be worrying about that as a teenager, and that can be very difficult to kind of focus on your studies. The growing numbers of 16 and 17-year-olds being placed in supported accommodation, which could be really difficult places to do your homework, to study. You might have limited access to Wi-Fi, there might be noise and problems, and we know that can be really challenging for young people. And also the instability within the care system itself. It's very hard to focus on school and education if you're being moved around, having to change school, and worrying about all of those things rather than being able to kind of focus on school. So I think there's a whole set of stuff around school itself, and there's lots more that universities could do, I think, to encourage young people. I think there's something about raising aspirations earlier. Often we have lower aspirations for our care experienced young people than we should do, and I think those conversations need to start earlier about the possibility in the future and the support that young people need to do well in school and university and work.
Are you aware of any universities that are doing particularly good work in this space?
So there are some universities universities. There has been progress, and I think universities will often have a named contact who can provide particular support to care experienced young people. Some universities provide year-round accommodation because, of course, for care experienced young people, they may not have somewhere to go in the holidays. And some universities do outreach, and we work with a lot of universities doing some good work in this space. So there is There are things happening. There is additional support for care experienced young people at universities. There is some financial support available. I would say awareness of it is lower than it should be, so there's something really about making sure children at school know about that early enough to think that university is an option for them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we work with a number of care experienced young people who are at university and are doing well there, but actually raising their ambition and aspiration is dependent upon them understanding that there are support mechanisms that are available to them within that environment. We recently published a report called No Bank of Mum and Dad, which does highlight some of the challenges for young people who move on to university, things like accommodation, out of term time, if you have something that breaks down, if you need to travel, just some of the finances that are available to young people. One of the challenges that I think could be addressed is that young people who are care experienced under 25 receive the lower rate of universal credit, and of course many of them are living independently and have exactly the same expensive cost of living pressures as anybody of any other age, but they also don't necessarily have the family support and networks to fall back upon, and I think that is a potential barrier. We run an education, employment and training programme over in Lincolnshire actually, and one of the things that we recognise is that this particular population of care experienced young people, because of a lot of the discontinuity that they have had, the wraparound support is really important to help them not just engage but to maintain their engagement over the long term when they hit a bump in the road. So higher ratios of staff, outreach work, really assertive provision and outreach work, some flexibility to be afforded, and holistic support for things like mental health and housing support as and when it's needed. Those have been the things that have enabled young people to stay the course and achieve really positive outcomes in employment, training and education provision.
And just to add, we run a service called Propel, which brings together information about what all the universities and colleges across the UK offer for care experienced young people, and it varies, but there is support out there. And we also support young people thinking about going to university or moving into work, their journey to get there, so that might be helping them with their UCAS statement or understanding what extra support they can access, and critically when they're at university, helping them stay there, because often care experienced young people are more likely to drop out of university because of the different challenges they face in their non-care experienced peers.
And have you got good information about the ones who are doing it well and information about the ones who aren't, shall we say, could do so with some improvement?
It's not really a judgment as such, it kind of more tells you what's there, who the named contact is, so it's really for young people to be able to think, if I'm thinking of going to that university, what help might be there for me. But there is, as you'd imagine, there is variety, and I do think there's more universities could do. I think they could also think more about their admissions process and looking at contextualised admissions, so taking into account the circumstances and the barriers that care experienced young people have faced to get even to the point where they might be thinking about
presumably the
university.
change of design in the UCAS form and the focus on asking questions and focusing on barriers is welcome from that perspective.
Yeah, I think it's important that young people have the opportunity to explain their journeys and the kind of additional hurdles that they'll often have overcome, and the kind of I don't really like the word resilience, because I think there's an assumption that kind of hardship is in some way a good thing, but care experienced young people have had to demonstrate immense fortitude to kind of even be getting to the point where university is a possibility, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration, and the disruptions to their schooling that's often taken place, often during exams. They might have had to leave care or have moved place, so I think it would be good to see more universities taking that into account and thinking about who they offer places.
I'd like to think about later care leavers going back into education, because, as you said, there's a lot of life experience there, and it may be only when you're 30 or 35 that you suddenly think, hang on, I didn't go to university. and I should be going to university. And encouraging older care leavers back into the education system, I think, is really important. It is a missed opportunity. And they can, you know, care leavers who are older can progress quite well in education because they have a lot of life experience to bring, really. And it might be worth thinking about offering some encouragement, because it can be a big step financially, to say, okay, you might be able to do this and we're going to give you a bit of support because we recognise, because of your care experience, you missed out.
Interesting. And so, with the lifelong learning entitlement, there should be opportunities to perhaps have some support with that to actually encourage people to look at this later on.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. And just in terms of the FE part of that, how effective is the sector at engaging with people both in care and care leavers? Obviously, it doesn't have the same level of resource as the HE sector, but does it? Do you find that as a sector generally open to trying to support care?
I think, again, it's really variable. You know, we do some work with FE colleges. We'll go in and we'll speak to staff, we'll speak to students who might be care experienced about the kind of particular challenges and barriers they might face and the support available. You're seeing both colleges and universities reaching out sometimes to schools or working with virtual school heads who have responsibility for care experienced children in their area. So there are initiatives happening and some positive steps, but like many of these things, it's patchy, some are better than others. It's certainly not consistent, and there is still not enough, in our opinion, of raising the aspirations of children at an early enough point that they can think about continuing an education in some form.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Andrew.
Thank you.
Very patiently.
Chairman? Yeah. So Lynn, could you elaborate on the statutory support scheme, some of the ideas you've got within that, and how practical that would be to roll out nationally, and what potential difficulties there may be in doing that?
Yeah, certainly. So we've had a couple of strategic partnerships with local authorities where we've been trialling different approaches to improve the offer to young people who are care experienced. We would like to see the publication of a national statutory offer of support for care leavers, which would really help to level the playing field, but also build on some of the best practice that we know is out there and provide the sort of consistency and continuity that we've talked about here today. So to give an illustration of that, free bus travel for care leavers is one of the things that we've looked at. So our Transport for Freedom report demonstrates how giving access to free bus travel can really help young people to access education, employment, training, but also other community assets, as well as, of course, really importantly, maintain contact with family and friends in their local area. Now, we estimate that to roll that out would cost approximately 77 million a year to implement. But what that free bus travel does for young people is means that they are more likely to be in employment, they are less likely to be experiencing loneliness and social isolation, and they are better able to contribute. That's one of the things that a young person said to me recently that was really important to them. Not having access to that free transport would have meant that they couldn't work, and if they can't work, they don't feel that they can make a valued contribution. And so that's one of the things that we would like to see. A comprehensive accommodation offer is really important. So improved access for the stay in put scheme so that more care leavers can stay with their foster parents for longer. That would, of course, require us to look at allowances for foster carers after children turn 18, especially for those who are still in education. And a national rollout of the Staying Close scheme is something that we think would also be very, very helpful. I referenced earlier the challenge with universal credit. So all care experienced young people who are claiming universal credit should really receive the over 25 rate of universal credit. They often struggle to make ends meet. They receive the lower rate of benefits, and they don't have families that they can lean into when they're in need of additional support. We find it increasingly the case that just the essentials, you know, the very bare essentials of food, energy, transport are a real challenge, and they are not any cheaper because they are younger. And so a change there, I think, would really help. Access to mental health support we've talked about today already, but a lead for mental health in every local authority area. The issue, I think, is about swift and easy access to mental health support. So that's the challenge. And Catherine talked earlier about the cliff edge in support when young people reach 18. That transition into adult services is also something that is a real challenge for many young people. And if we were to extend with some consistency the role of the virtual school head, as you talked about earlier, that would also support in respect of further and higher education for young people who are in care and care experienced. So those are some of the things. The role of the private sector, I think, is also important here. So we've been doing some work recently as part of a 2-year partnership with the Bank of England, for example, that looks at financial education and financial inclusion for young people, many of whom find it quite difficult to access bank accounts. They often don't have the documentation that they need to do that, but also they don't have the financial literacy. And so there are, I think, partnerships that we can look at that can also increase the support to young people and have a very positive impact. The Care Leavers Covenant, I think, is an important first step in some of that, and has really amplified, I think, the needs of this group of children and young people, and given better recognition to that. So a step in the right direction.
Thank you. So just to sort of round up, really, I mean, when I was leader of Derbyshire County Council, 2009 to 13, it's a bit of a gloomy reflection that all of these issues were exactly the same issues that we were discussing at the time, and all of the desire to improve the outcomes were all of the same, and the results have, alas, been all of the same as well. So wanted to ask all of you really specifically what you think national and local government can do to prioritise voices that looked after children and care leavers when reforming the care system. Start with you, Will.
Yeah, the issue of voice of care leavers, I think, is really important. There's been some very good work done by other organisations for younger care leavers. I think it's important to recognise that older care leavers, as they leave the system, they reflect on it. As they get older, they reflect on it more, and they can be an enormous resource in terms of how to shape systems that work. And that needs to be taken into account. And we don't really feel that experience is listened to, because you have people say you battle through the system and you get out of the system at the other end, and then you need a period of reflection, and then you can start talking about what you think could be done better. And there are lots of older care leavers who want to help, actually, and who have life experience that you should draw on. And government should do that, and we don't think it's being done well enough.
Thank you, Catherine.
I think absolutely listening to the voices of children and young people as well. They know what needs to change in the system, and they're often very brilliant advocates for that. I think more broadly we know what needs to change, and the two big things for us is improving stability within the system itself, so that children are moved left and they're kept closer to their home area, and then getting rid of the care cliff that so many young people face as they age out of care. We know what needs to change, we know what the kind of policy changes that are needed are, and it now needs to have the political priority and the investment and the urgency to back that up.
Thank you. And Lynn?
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree that the expertise and the experience of children and young people is really important. here. We had a group of young people actually who fed in directly to the review itself and came up with a checklist of things that they felt were important that they shared with Josh McAllister at the time. We've also recently been contracted by the Department for Education to provide opportunities for children and young people to have their voices heard as the reform programme develops. Our key learning so far, I think, is that you need to include a range of different methodologies for engaging with children and young people, interactive opportunities, opportunities for them to be able to pose direct questions to policy teams and to receive meaningful responses. I think that's what's really important. But there are a range of techniques that we can also use to collate anonymous feedback, including from marginalised groups within the care population, but we have to look beyond consultation here and further than young people just sharing their experiences. So some of the work that we've done, for example, in some local areas is to have teams of young inspectors, which has enabled them to have some say on the quality and the sufficiency of provision in their area. So we think it's really important and if, as a committee, there was an interest in engagement with children and young people who are care experienced, then we would also be very happy to support and facilitate that.
Well, I'm grateful for that, and I think that's certainly something that further into the inquiry we will be looking to engage with all of your organisations around, because I think that is definitely an opportunity we want to take. I'm very grateful for the evidence from this panel. If we can switch panels to a second, that would be great. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Apologies if I get the pronunciation wrong here.